Good afternoon. Welcome to National Gallery. My name is Carlo Corsato. I work in the National Learning and National Programs Department. I'm an educator here at the National Gallery, and today we discuss altarpieces in the age of Leonardo da Vinci. When you put Leonardo and altarpiece in the same sentence, I suppose you all think of the Virgin of the Rocks, which is a very incredibly difficult painting to explore. So I will do that, I promise. I will talk about the Virgin of the Rocks. But before doing that, I think we should try to reconstruct the visual context of altarpieces in Renaissance Italy. So whether you're familiar or not with altarpieces, you should bear in mind there is a very complex type of images. So I tried to create a sort of solar system to understand the various aspects related to an altarpiece. I promise that all the images you can see now, they will be clearer and in full detail later. So what we have, when we have an altarpiece, we have a size-specific type of image. Is related, very often is actually sitting above an altar, right? What's inside the image is obviously a religious image with very often a narrative, not all the times, and definitely the Virgin of the Rocks is an exception in that sense. I will clarify that in a moment. We also need to bear in mind that an altarpiece is a liturgical item, meaning that it's part of a ritual or set of rituals. So it is an image with a specific purpose. Inside an altarpiece, you find what I just simply define a vision. So you find realities that don't belong to our world. So they project in us into a completely different dimension, divine dimension. And related to the fact is that it serves a liturgy is also a painting that needs to be used by people for worship. It's usually public worship in a church, but it can also be semi-public in an oratory or in a private chapel in a palace. But it's never a painting for just one person. And in fact, the last bit we need to remember is a painting from a community to a community, for a community. So it's an image that needs to be understood and read in plurality, like we are doing today. And all these elements are interconnected. That's why we called the exhibition regarding the Virgin of the Rocks at the National Gallery an experience. That's the power of images. They're syncretic. They give you all at once all these different elements, and you need to absorb it. You need to find a way to unpick in the different elements and then to put them together. The unity of these elements is the secret of an altarpiece. So I want to start with religious narrative and community, two of the elements involved. And since today is the 6th of January, in Christianity we celebrate the Epiphany of Jesus Christ, I thought it was very appropriate to start with Adoration of the Kings. We are in Florence, we are in the Dominican Church of Santa Maria Novella. The painting now is in the Uffizi in Florence, but originally was in a chapel in this Dominican church. And let's explore together the narrative. The focal point is in the top center. You got baby Jesus, the Virgin clearly, and as a secondary figure, as always the case in this type of images, in this subject, Joseph, the father. Mother and father, they're looking down and drawing our attention to the real focal point, which is the baby. The story, I suppose you're familiar with the story, but anyway, 3 wise men travel to Palestine to meet the new king of the Jews. And they hoped was in a palace, so they visited King Herod's palace. They couldn't find him there, and actually they found him thanks to a guiding star in a very humble dwelling. And Botticelli tried to create a possible image of this dwelling. And then you got the 3 wise men. Actually in the Bible, they simply say wise men. There's no number, but we know they got 3 gifts. Gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And for that reason, traditionally, they're always 3. But what is quite interesting in this image, there is a special relationship between the elders and Jesus. It's a proper adoration. And if you look on the right-hand side of the image, they go in 2 pairs. You got the middle-aged and the youngest king at the bottom. they create a sort of tunnel, a visual tunnel that you can ideally look through, and look through you go to the eldest king and baby Jesus. Baby Jesus is blessing the eldest king. So the painting works very well from an angled vision. But at the same time, you got two more characters. They're part of the people attending this special event, and one of the two, the one with the hat, is actually inviting all the left-hand side of the composition towards the center. When you look at the disposition, the pagination of this image, you see that all these characters, the ones that I highlighted, they're like related. There's an hierarchy between these five people. The reasons for that is because they're members of the same family. You got the grandfather at the very top, Cosimo de' Medici, Piero, called Piero de' Gauti, because as you can imagine, in a family, and the Medici family was an exception, you got recurring names over the generations. The brother, Giovanni, and if you can see the dates, that's why I included the dates, they're all dead when this painting was actually painted. We dated approximately about 1575. So the only two alive are actually the grandchildren, and one of the two is very famous, is Lorenzo the Magnificent. Let's explore more. On the other side of the composition, on the right, you got a man looking at you. That's the patron, the one that paid for the painting. Gaspare di Zanobi del Lama is associated with the Medici family, and we are not 100% sure, but I really like this version of the story. Probably the one on the very far right is the painter himself, Sandro Botticelli, which certainly wasn't that handsome, but anyway, you know, when you are the artist, you can beautify yourself, you can Photoshop yourself as much as you like. And it's quite interesting that the two opposite ends, you've got like two columns, two pillars, Giuliano and Botticelli. In between the two men here, the two, Giuliano and Lorenzo, there is another one who is actually hugging Giuliano. And for what I'm about to say, I have no evidence, but again, I really like this version of the story. I hope you enjoyed it as well. One of the possible identification for this man is actually Francesco de' Pazzi. Who's Francesco de' Pazzi? Right, he's the brother-in-law of the two guys over there, because his brother, Guglielmo, married Bianca de' Medici. But why so famous? Because approximately 3 years after this painting was painted, in 1478, he murdered Giuliano. and nearly missed actually Lorenzo as well. So this painting was just to warm up, but I think you got the general idea, right? A painting can be a very controversial, an altarpiece can be a very controversial image. You represent society, you want to be recognized in that image, and you send a message, a civic, political, devotional as well, message to a specific audience, or we should say specific audiences, plural, but I will clarify that in a moment. Right, move on. The second aspect we need to consider is that altarpiece is a handmade work, right? So there's some craft and there's some legal aspects involved in the creation of an altarpiece. And I want to carry on with an adoration of the kings, because for this one, painted by Ghirlandaio approximately 10 years after Botticelli's one, for the Foundling Hospital in Florence, we have the contract, survived the contract. I got some excerpts from you. This is part from the original document. That this day, 23rd October 1485, the said Francesco commits and entrusts to that said Domenico, this is the painter, the first one is the commissioner, the painting of a panel which the said Francesco has made and has provided. So materials in this case are provided. It's not always the case. And he is to color, the painter, is to color and paint the said panel all with his own hand. That means that the workshop can be involved, but this painting, this commission cannot be subcontracted to a different workshop in the manner showed in a drawing on paper. meaning that you got a project on paper, they agreed on the final composition, and they say, okay, according to that blueprint, we want the finished painting. With those figures, and in that manner shown in it. And every particular according to what Fra Bernardo, so there is another man involved, a sort of advisor, is part of the religious body, think best. He, the painter, must color the panel at his own expense with good colors. So not all the materials now we discover are actually part of the contract. And with powdered gold on such ornaments as demanded with any other expenses incurred in the same panel. And the blue must be ultramarine, the very expensive one, of the value, just to explain the quality they want, about 4 florins the ounce. And he must have made and delivered complete the set panel within 30 months from today. Ghirlandaio was very good, actually, to deliver the panel in time. This is quite important to remember, because when we talk about the Virgin of the Rocks, we'll see a completely different situation. But this is a good contract, well drafted, with all the details clear, and the task very well detailed. Unfortunately, it's not the same for the Virgin of the Rocks. This is one of the big problems we have in understanding the commission, what really happened. So now we leave Florence, and we go to Milan, finally, with Leonardo. This is a view, a topographical view of Milan. It's a much later, but what we see at the very top is the place we are interested in, the Church of San Francesco Grande. Unfortunately, the church that no longer exists, and also was transformed various times over the centuries, from the 15th to the 18th century. So it's a bit difficult for us to understand even the original location of the Virgin of the Rocks. But judging from what we can understand from the documents, we know there was a separate chapel dedicated to the Immaculate Conception, and it was pretty much located in front of the nave on the left. It was a separate space. And in this contract, which is quite long and involves many artists, talking about community, also artistic community, on the 13th item, we can finally find the Virgin of the Rocks. The panel in the middle, we'll understand in the middle of what in a moment, to be painted on a flat surface with Our Lady and her Son, and the angels, done in oil to perfection, with fine colors as stated above. So as you can see from the other contract, this is much more vague. There's not many details. There's one is very important, on a flat surface, because as I will show you in a moment, most of the altarpiece was actually sculpted. It's lost, but we can pretty much reconstruct it with caution as usual, using other surviving examples that the sculpture involved in the Virgin of the Rocks altarpiece made elsewhere. The name of that sculpture is Giacomo del Maino. And in another altarpiece dedicated, again, to the Immaculate Conception in San Maurizio in Ponte in Valtellina, he created this altarpiece you can see. But from the document, from the Virgin of the Rocks document, we know that at the top there was something that is missing in this one. The 11th item says the Sibyls with painted backgrounds to be on a dome constructed in the form of a building, with colored garments painted differently one from another, all in oils. So fortunately, we have another example surviving, with at the top a dome. We don't know if the one in San Francesco Grande was octagonal like this one. Certainly, the Sibyls were probably creating a less crowded ensemble over there. But let's use that example and try to imagine this one in the center from San Maurizio with the top. Must look something like this. But if we read the document again, we just discover there's something else. The sculpture of the Virgin, the kneeling Virgin by Del Maino, was actually in the top tier. So let's move it. And the Virgin of the Rocks is supposed to be there. Right, as you can see, it's a very complex type of images, right? It's got many things, many secondary stories on the sides. We know actually the two associates of Leonardo, the two local painters, Ambrogio and Evangelista de Predis, were asked to paint flanking angels, singing and playing instruments. So there's many things when you look at this reconstruction you should be aware of, right? So don't go outside and say, oh, we just found the perfect reconstruction. No, it's just a vague general idea to give you a sense of what you should expect walking to San Francesco Grande. And the two bits, that's why interesting. You got twice the Virgin. I will go back to this point later. Right. According to the general reconstruction that scholars provided, we know that he painted two versions. The first one is in the Louvre, and I digitally put it in the frame that in the exhibition we have here at the National Gallery we recreated to give you a sense of the experience, the visual experience that you should have looking at this image. We know that at some point there was a disagreement, meaning that in the contract they agreed, I mean the confraternity and the painters, plural, they agreed to be paid for the central panel later when it was finished, but the amount wasn't agreed. So when Leonardo finished his work, the confraternity offered 25 ducats and Leonardo wanted 100. Saying that actually was a third party, is not named in the documents, was ready to pay cash straight away to get the painting. We don't know actually if he sold it, if it was just threatening to sell it. We don't know all the circumstances. What we know that in the end he was forced to do another version, and that the entire commission was protracted in total for 25 years, so a long time. And in the end, in 1508, when they sold the painting and they settled, the amount paid was actually 40 ducats. So Leonardo lost his plea and paid probably more than he needed, because if it's true that this is the second version, he also needs to pay for the materials to paint it. Right, we'll leave the Virgin of the Rocks there for a moment. I will go back. We try to understand the other aspects related, community and liturgy. So, if in our solar system we have now the Virgin of the Rocks in the middle, we need to try to understand how all these different elements work together. So we know already that it was a very specific site, a chapel in San Francesco Grande. We know there was a sort of religious narrative. I will go back to this point. We also know that was part, because it was sitting on an altar, was part of a liturgy, of a specific liturgy, because on the 8th of December, the first year actually they started celebrating this liturgy was on 1478, the Feast of the Immaculate Conception. So it was very, very related to a specific moment in their liturgical calendar. We'll definitely see a vision. I'll go back to that in a moment. It was part of a public space, so it was meant to serve a public worship and definitely a community, probably plural communities, but for sure the community of the confraternity that paid for this painting. But when we look at the image itself, I just try to forget the rocks. That's the main reason why we call it that way. The four characters, they look like intertwined, interlinked, all together. And whatever is the angle you look at the image, you're like trapped in a loop. Even if you start from St. John the Baptist, then there is this diagonal and this and the eyes looking downward of the Virgin is creating this relationship. Then you have this diagonal created by the gesture of the hand. And you move to the angel. The angel is moving your attention, drawing your attention to St. John the Baptist again. And then if you're looking down, you finally find Jesus Christ. But he's blessing again the infant, St. John the Baptist, and you just basically go in circle all the times. I already identified for you all the people. But I want to start understanding the dynamic between these three. I want to leave the angel out of the picture for a moment. So the infant John the Baptist, baby Jesus, and the Virgin Mary. In particular, John the Baptist and baby Jesus, they have a specific moment in the religious history of the life of Jesus when they are together. And I presume, since we call him the Baptist, you're all thinking of the baptism of Christ. In the gallery we have one of the most beautiful, probably, examples of this subject. And I just included the general reconstruction of the altarpiece because it's part of the experience, unfortunately, the National Gallery we can't recreate because the rest of the altarpiece is still in San Sepolcro. But that's pretty much the general arrangement. But just focusing again on the main panel, the two protagonists obviously are Jesus and John. This important gesture, that's the baptism, throwing the water over the head of Jesus. And the moment represented is actually very well described in the Bible, in the Gospel of Matthew. As soon as Jesus was baptized, he went up out of the water. At that moment, heaven was opened, and he saw the Spirit of God, the Holy Dove, descending like a dove and alighting on him. And a voice from the heaven said, "This is my Son, whom I love, with him I'm well pleased." It's not accidental, since this is a sort of second epiphany, it's not accidental that we celebrate the baptism of Christ the following week after the Epiphany. So the coming Sunday is going to be the feast of the baptism of Christ. So the two, John and Jesus, are very much related. You probably know they're also literally related, got a family relation. They are cousins. And in the Bible it's very well explained that John needs to come first, but he's also the last of the prophets to come and announce the coming of Jesus. So you need the two to have the full epiphany of the grown-up Jesus in the world. What's his mission? So I'm comparing these three paintings for two reasons. Right, his mission is obviously, unfortunately, to die on the cross. And we have a beautiful example in our collection, the Mount Crucifixion by Raphael. So this sacrifice is the ultimate reason for the coming of Jesus. And dying on the cross and eventually resurrecting, he will save the mankind. But and then here you got the second moment. So he's dying on the cross. And then if you go to see Michelangelo's entombment, we have also in the National Gallery, you can see the dramatic moment of the dead body. And John the Evangelist and one of the Marys try to carry this very heavy body. What is the difference between these two images and the central one by Piero? The other two, they try to engage with you, create an emotional engagement. The Christ in the baptism is actually very aloof. It's like a sort of reinvention of a Byzantine icon, right? It's showing his divinity. That's because it's the Epiphany. It's just showing his transformation. It's not just a man like any other. And this is the moment, during this ritual, he's becoming something more. Here, in the other two, the entombment and the crucifixion, you have a completely different type of engagement. You need to understand the meaning and the importance of the sacrifice. That's why they organize completely differently, in a completely different way, the images, right? So I'm just trying to say we need to be flexible when we approach altarpieces because the function is very important. Talking about the death of Christ, one of probably the most important altarpieces showing this emotional engagement between the mother and the dead son is absolutely Michelangelo's Pietà in St. Peter. Sometimes we forget this is an altarpiece, actually. And it's quite fascinating, also a good reminder that an altarpiece can be just sculpted, not necessarily painted. There's another element I wanted to include with this interesting comparison between the Virgin in the Virgin of the Rocks and the Virgin in the Michelangelo's Pietà, what they called in the Renaissance time softness, dolcezza, this ability to render the serenity of the divinity as well, the dignity of the divinity. I will go back to the dignity, so try to remember this word. Right, go back to our Virgin of the Rocks. So let's try to explore now what happens when the angel, or an angel as well, is part of an image. Angels are very, very peculiar and specific type of creatures we can find in a painting, right? And the link and the visual connection between the Virgin and the angel is just in this area over here. The gesture, the extended hand, and the face. The soft face, delicate face, supernatural, if you like, so over the nature face of the angel. Looking at the infant St. John the Baptist, but in between, in the way, there is the hand. Right, the most important moment when an angel and the Virgin Mary are together is clearly the Annunciation, which is very important to understand the Immaculate Conception. And we have one of the most extraordinary, I would say, Annunciation here in the National Gallery, the one by Carlo Crivelli, which is my favorite for many reasons. This painting was part of my job interview. I got the job thanks to this painting. So can you imagine there's a very emotional and personal connection with this painting, right? Just forgetting this for a moment. Here we go. We got the angel just there, right in the middle, opposite to the Virgin Mary, with the usual lily, symbol of purity. But with him, with the angel, we have another character, which is definitely not part of the story, the bishop, Sant'Emidius. And he's holding the model of a city, the city of Ascoli. I will go back to this detail in a second, right? But what is fascinating, there is this clear, private, if you like, relationship, which is very intellectual because there's no exchanging glances, right? It's just a spiritual connection that we perceive because of the perspective and the angle created when we move from the angel to the Virgin Mary. And at the top, there's a completely different scene. It's definitely not part. You can't find any trace of this in the Bible. There is a man completely, apparently, disinterested in what is happening down in the street. Is busy reading something that we can actually know what it's about because the painter just wrote in Roman capital letters at the very bottom, Libertas Ecclesiastica. So, an angel is a messenger. We know what is the message this time, is announcing that the Virgin will give birth of a very special baby Jesus. And if we focus on then on the right-hand side of the composition, we have an interior of a house, ideally Mary's house. She's a very good girl. Look at that. She tied up the room very well. And the special relationship I was saying, the angel doing a specific blessing gesture, and she's accepting. She's devout and accepting. The acceptance of the Virgin is crucial. Right? Without her acceptance, there's no nativity, no Jesus Christ, nothing, right? She needs to accept that role. And then two details. The one above, the Spirit of God, if you want to quote from Matthew's Gospel, the dove, the Holy Spirit, another messenger. This is actually the real messenger, or if you like, is the message. She's about to accept that. And then the two details that intrigue all the kids when we talk about this painting during our school visits in the gallery. A gourd, or a giant gherkin if you like, and an apple. They're all related to the beginning and the end. The apple is the unfortunate beginning with Adam and Eve eating the apple they shouldn't eat and causing all the troubles we are suffering every day. And then finally, a symbol of resurrection, at the same time also a symbol of community. What happens if you slice this in two? Got loads of C's in there, right? Is the plurality of the community we are, right? So resurrection of Christ and the fall of the mankind, just placed there. That's the role, that's her role, not just giving birth. It's giving birth to the Savior, to the Redeemer. That's the message. But if we move on the other side of the composition, because it's literally split in two halves, we have a street of what we may assume a Renaissance city, but Ascoli wasn't that cool and nice at that time, was still pretty much a medieval city. So it's the imaging of an idealized city. And in that city, something is happening. And I show you how to read now what is going on in there. We need to start from the very bottom. Just bear in mind, altarpieces are always hanging very high. So even if you don't want, very often you start from the bottom and you make your way up to the top. And we can find three crests. One belongs to the Bishop of Ascoli, Prospero Caffarelli. As you can see, actually, he was the bishop for quite a long time. At that time, the Pope was Innocent VIII. But the Pope was actually essential for understanding what is going on here was the previous Pope, Sixtus IV. I'll go back to this guy in a moment. And then the crest of Ascoli. So you've got two powers, Pope, Bishop, all the two connected to the city, because the city of Ascoli was part of the Papal States at that point. But they claiming some libertas ecclesiastica, some freedom from the church. Well, something very curious happened on the 25th of March, so the day of the Annunciation, 1482. They tried to press on the Pope, Sixtus IV, to get this administrative or semi-administrative freedom, or semi-freedom, depends on what you want to phrase it. But anyway, they want to be partially free from the control of the Pope. And the Pope at that moment was pretty much busy with a big war against Naples. So they send emissaries to Rome, to the Papal court, to get this freedom. They put a lot of pressure, and as a good Pope should do, he said, maybe, we'll consider it. And then sent back a message to Ascoli. And that's this moment we should probably imagine the Chancellor, Antonio Grazioso Benincasa, reading the message with a big maybe, and said, I can't say maybe. So he said, we got it. Right? And that's exactly how a new start for the city started. So the day of the Annunciation, and in many cities in Italy, it was also true in England, was actually the first day of the year, they started over with a semi-freedom granted or semi-granted by the Pope. So this image needs to be read from this corner. We are in Ascoli. This is our patron saint, is a bishop, so we don't want to send away the church from our city. We want to be partially free from it. And then you move up, and you've got a Franciscan there, because we are in a Franciscan convent. It's a convent church, actually. And then you keep moving up, and you finally have the Chancellor. So a community and multiple identities are kept together in unity in one image. And then clearly, because of the perspective and also the rays of light, the golden rays of light coming down from the heaven, you also go down. And you find yourself in a sort of visual loop, reiterating and repeating all the times the identity represented in this picture. So remember, in the Virgin of the Rocks, we have also a loop. That's why I try to unpack this painting for you. Right, I think we're ready to move on and to finally discuss the most pressing matter, the most complicated matter, the Immaculate Conception. To do that, we move now to Venice. We are in the Franciscan church, not surprised. The biggest, actually, the most important, the major Franciscan church in Venice, the Church of Frari, or Santa Maria Gloriosa dei Frari, is another very important place to myself. My parents got married over there. And, sorry, I'm becoming a bit sentimental today. It's not my habit. But anyway, if you go to the sacristy, before you actually walk into the sacristy, you have this very sober monument dedicated to Benedetto Pesaro. The reason for that is because he was a very important captain. He was actually the leader of the fleet of the Venetian Republic, and he is also the most important member in the family. And this chapel, the sacristy, is actually the family chapel of the Pesaro family. When we walk in there and we approach the altar, first we see exactly what we discussed at the very beginning, right? You can clearly see that the altarpiece is a very super size-specific type of image. But also, you will see just before the altar, this tomb, the tomb of a woman, was very exceptional at that time. I'm not 100% sure, but I actually think this is the first altarpieces dedicated to a woman, definitely in Venice, but probably also in Italy. And the reason for that is because the saints represented in the two flanking panels are the father, and the husband, and the three sons of Franceschina throne. The father is here, is Pietro, Peter. Then you got Nicholas, Mark, and Benedict. You probably remember that we already met Benedict. Remember this book, because I won't show it again. It's like a trick of good magicians. I won't show you the trick again, but just remember the book. And in the central panel, you finally have the Virgin. She's above a pedestal, an octagonal pedestal, and you got Jesus, who's very active. He's blessing again. He's looking on the other side, because he's tried to connect the two sides. On one side, you got the trick, right? That I won't show you again. And the other side is actually completing the reading and creating the visual loop. But there's another trick here, where she's sitting. There's not throne, but it looks like it. She's the throne. She's, as we say in Latin, the sedes sapientiae, right? The throne of wisdom. She's the throne for Jesus. And ultimately, she will be also in heaven, and she will be the queen of heaven. And it's exactly what is written in mosaic, or painted mosaic, in the half dome just above her head. Sure gate of heaven, lead my mind, direct my life, where all do be committed to thy care. And finally, we are ready for the vision. Another image of the Immaculate Conception is actually here in the National Gallery by Crivelli, the same author, the same artist of the Annunciation. And this is one of the earliest examples of the Immaculate Conception. Let's try to set the scene. Where is she? She's in no space. She's a sort of a marble niche, surrounded by gold, the light of heaven, with angels everywhere, and God the Father coming from the higher up of the skies, blessing her and sending again the Holy Dove. But since the image wasn't clear enough, because there was no precedent, right? This image, this subject, this iconography was never represented before. That's actually the same problem that Leonardo had when created the Virgin of the Rocks. Crivelli added an explanation, a written explanation. As I was conceived from the beginning in the mind of God, even so was I made. I know it sounds a bit difficult, but that's the trick, meaning that's exactly what you can read in the book that Saint Benedict had in the triptych in the Frari, right? So it's showing the explanation. What I always wondered is, unless you're not really close to the painting, you can't see it. That's a very important thing to remember. Not necessarily all the messages that are part of an altarpiece are for everyone, right? So the people that was aware of this message, they could read it without reading it. They knew already what was written actually in the panel. And the explanation comes from the Bible, are two different quotes combined in one, and they are explaining the secret of the Immaculate Conception, that the Virgin was conceived before the creation, so before time in heaven, before the fall of the mankind, pure, sinless, without any sin. So she always been sinless, without any sin. Because in the mind of God, all the creation and the unfolding of the history was already created, including he anticipated that Eve eventually would eat the apple. And indeed, again, you got the apple in the painting. And also God already anticipated that he needed to send his son to secure resurrection and to redeem that sin. And for that redemption, Christ needed to become human. She needed clearly the help of a woman, a co-redemptrix, as we call it. And mother and son are instrumental for this plan of God. And much later, this iconography was developed from something like this into the proper subject that we now recognize as the Immaculate Conception. Now the source is a completely different book in the Bible, it's the Apocalypse, and they included symbols. You got a dome, a crescent, rose, lily, and the stars, a crown of stars. I really like this version of Tiepolo because you can see now she's wearing a completely different robe, right? The white or silver robe is the one she wears when she's the Queen of Heaven. And here, Crivelli tried to recreate this, spotting with a wonderful pattern in gold to explain that actually she's a bit of transition. She's in heaven, the gold, but she's about to become human, as Christ is becoming human, and then she will return to the heaven, thanks to the Assumption, and finally the crowning, that she will be finally the Queen of Heaven. I try to keep it simple, because I'm pretty sure that if there's any theologians here, will be horrified with my explanation, but it's really, really complex. Another reason I kept it very simple is because I always wondered how many people could really understand this doctrine that was actually created as a proper dogma only in the 19th century. The earliest version, or certainly one of the earliest, is the one painted by Crivelli's brother, Vittore, for another Franciscan church. And here you got something that is really, really interesting for the Virgin of the Rocks. You got the Virgin. She's covered with a golden robe. We now know she's in heaven. There is an anticipation she will be the queen. She's got a crown. You got the usual symbols. Now you're definitely expert. Apple, gold, you know already. But what is fascinating now, we got Jesus Christ at the very bottom. She's adoring baby Jesus, who is actually laying down on a very comfortable bed of seraphims. So they both in heaven. And there is a symbol here which is very fascinating, the carnation, just in clear, transparent water, the purity of the divine love. That's the symbol of the carnation. So everything was already predetermined, but also in this case, since they invented an image that didn't exist before with no visual tradition, they put an explanation, this beautiful scroll. Call to them, which is us, my glorious Son, who will be able to contemplate your dignity. You probably remember we already said this word once, right? Which is a very complex, dignitas, is a very complex concept because you have in this word the royal dignity of God, the King of the Jews. We started from there, you probably remember. But at the same time, this very frail baby is actually very dignified because it's not just a baby, got a very important mission. I think we're ready to go back to the Virgin of the Rocks. I tell you already, I don't have definitive answers. Just try to show you how we can approach this image and have a meaningful experience. We know that in the underdrawing, in some of the sketches that Leonardo made for this painting, there's actually the Virgin kneeling down. And in one of the sketches, she's adoring baby Jesus, which is actually lying on the ground. And here you got a more complex version of this adoration. So he's working with a similar concept that Vittore Crivelli developed. We don't know why they discarded this version. We don't know if it was perceived as redundant with the minor sculptures at the top, if they changed their minds. We certainly know that the contract was very vague. And I have the impression they wanted to keep it a bit open because they're still defining this iconography. They're still defining the concept, the way to explain it visually. But whatever is the reason, whatever was the decisions they made, in the end, they decided for this version. I know that the Louvre version is slightly different, but the general composition is the same. And when we approach this image, you know now how to try to get into the image. You know that you need to be part of this loop, this visual loop. But there is a big problem. You're not meant to walk in this space. This space was painted in a very clear way, clear manner, that you can't really access it. There is a dramatic drop here. There's a cliff. You can just, figure out how deep is that. But definitely is very deep. And the space in the image, and the real space, the real dimension where you are completely divided physically and allegorically. But with your soul, with your spirit, you can jump in the image. And finally, when you do that, you create a direct engagement with this beautiful, serene, slightly sad Virgin. She's looking down. She knows already what's about to happen. They are no real space. They're surrounded by rocks. Rocks, mountains in general, are the perfect space for visions. St. Francis met Christ on the top of a mountain and he got the stigmata impressed on his body, right? So it's a primordial space. The reason why they didn't want to paint heaven is obscure to me, at least. But it's definitely a non-real space and it requires you to ascend to this place, right? You need to ascend from your reality, walking in there, understand that everything, you included, are part of a larger, bigger plan. That always was predetermined. Your salvation was already considered and planned carefully by God. When you got that feeling, you're finally ready to go over this group and start walking into the landscape you see, to more higher peaks, if you like. And that moment, finally, you can see over the hill. Finally, you are in light, in the light of God. All the questions are answered, including why they wanted to redo Mary Poppins. But all the answers will be answered. I don't know if you're going to have just one answer or multiple answers. If you got just one, choose wisely. At that moment, you feel very devout, you're very religious, you probably find yourself saying, "I'm ready, my Lord."